What started as a casual moment of humiliation in the sterile corridors of Meridian Research Institute would end with the perpetrator standing in a federal holding facility, facing not just legal consequences, but the unbridled fury of an admiral whose authority stretched across 3 naval districts and whose reputation for justice was as formidable as her tactical brilliance. But none of this would have happened if Director James Hartwell had bothered to do the most basic background check on the woman he decided to publicly humiliate in front of nearly 200 of his staff members. What he didn't know, what nobody knew, was that the timid research assistant he'd been systematically tormenting for the past 8 weeks was actually Captain Katherine Ashford, one of the most decorated intelligence officers in the Naval Operations Command, currently operating under deep cover as part of a classified investigation into the very corruption that had taken root at Meridian like a malignant tumor. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The facility itself was supposed to be a beacon of innovation and scientific excellence. Nestled in the rolling hills outside Portland, Oregon, Meridian Research Institute had been contracted by the Department of Defense to conduct cutting-edge research into marine surveillance systems and underwater communication technologies. On paper, it was a prestigious assignment that attracted some of the brightest minds in the country. In reality, it had become a cesspool of mismanagement, financial fraud, safety violations, and systematic abuse of authority that had somehow managed to evade official scrutiny for nearly 2 years. The reports had started trickling in about 6 months ago. Anonymous complaints about safety protocols being ignored, equipment funds disappearing without documentation, and a pattern of workplace harassment that seemed specifically designed to drive out anyone who asked difficult questions. Researchers were being intimidated into silence. Junior staff members were experiencing psychological pressure that bordered on torment. And at the center of it all was James Hartwell, the facilities director, a man whose authoritarian management style had transformed what should have been a collaborative research environment into a fiefdom where fear was the primary currency and obedience was the only acceptable response. When the Navy's Inspector General received the 15th formal complaint in as many weeks, something had to be done. But traditional investigation methods had failed repeatedly. Hartwell was too clever to leave obvious evidence. His abuse was carefully calibrated to stay just within the gray areas of workplace law where individual actions might seem unreasonable but weren't quite illegal enough to trigger automatic investigations. Previous inspectors had found nothing concrete, either because the evidence was too subtle or because Hartwell's network of intimidated employees had learned to keep silent. That's where Katherine Ashford came in. She was a specialist in exactly this kind of situation. Someone who could disappear into any role, someone whose natural intelligence and adaptability made her invisible to the untrained eye. Her real background was the kind of thing that only appeared in classified files locked away in secure facilities. A master's degree from MIT in both computer science and systems engineering. Fluency in 5 languages. 12 years of active military service with distinction marks in every evaluation. She'd conducted undercover operations in 7 different countries. She'd infiltrated criminal organizations, exposed terrorist cells, and documented human rights abuses in conflict zones. She had psychological profiles written about her by military strategists who marveled at her ability to construct believable personas that could withstand scrutiny from suspicious, intelligent, and dangerous adversaries. But at Meridian Research Institute, Katherine had to become someone far more vulnerable. She had to become Dr. Emily Rosewood, a struggling research assistant with a master's degree in marine biology, but lacking the confident bearing of someone who truly believed in herself. Emily had a backstory as complex as it was believable. A woman who had graduated from a mid-tier university with decent grades but nothing spectacular. Someone whose career had stalled despite her intelligence. Someone who had taken the Meridian position out of desperation rather than ambition. Emily was the perfect target for someone like Hartwell because she appeared to have no powerful connections, no advocates within the system, and no resources to fight back if things went wrong. The preparation for this assignment had consumed 3 months of Katherine's life. She'd studied videos of researchers who'd struggled to adapt to demanding environments. She'd interviewed former Meridian employees who'd quit under mysterious circumstances. She'd practiced the mannerisms of someone overwhelmed by workplace dynamics, perfected the hesitations of a person afraid of making mistakes, and even altered the way she walked to suggest less confidence than she naturally possessed. She'd fabricated an entire employment history, created fake academic transcripts, and built a digital footprint that would withstand any cursory investigation. Every detail had been obsessively researched and carefully rehearsed. What nobody at Meridian understood was that every interaction with Director Hartwell was being meticulously documented in Katherine's exceptional memory, ready to be transcribed into detailed incident reports that would eventually land on the desk of Admiral Helena Winters, the commanding officer of Naval Intelligence Operations and one of the highest-ranking women in the entire United States Navy. Admiral Winters had been tracking the Meridian situation for months, growing increasingly concerned that a facility entrusted with sensitive defense research had become compromised by corruption and negligence. She'd personally selected Katherine for this assignment because she knew that if anyone could penetrate the wall of silence surrounding Hartwell's leadership, it was someone with Katherine's unique combination of intelligence, composure, and determination. The psychological toll of maintaining such a comprehensive deception had been heavier than Katherine had anticipated. Watching genuinely brilliant researchers become so intimidated by Hartwell's arbitrary cruelty that they stopped contributing ideas in meetings. Seeing talented scientists compromise their professional integrity to avoid becoming targets for his harassment. Observing how fear could transform a workplace culture from collaborative to toxic in ways that undermined not just individual careers but the mission itself. These observations had reinforced Katherine's understanding of exactly how dangerous someone like Hartwell could be when given unchecked authority. During her 8 weeks at Meridian, Katherine had documented 47 distinct incidents of workplace harassment, 12 instances of protocol violations that could compromise research integrity, and evidence of systematic financial misappropriation that suggested millions of dollars were being diverted from legitimate research purposes. She'd recorded conversations, photographed documents, and interviewed terrified staff members who were finally beginning to trust that someone else understood the reality of their situation. She was building an airtight case that would not only destroy Hartwell's career but would expose the institutional failures that had allowed his corruption to flourish unchecked. But Hartwell, in his arrogance and his hunger for absolute control, was about to provide her with something far more valuable than documents or recordings. He was about to give her a moment of such blatant, public, witnessed abuse that it would become impossible for anyone, no matter how connected or clever, to explain away or minimize. He was about to make the catastrophic mistake of underestimating the woman he thought was powerless, never understanding that he was about to cross a line with someone who had the authority to bring down not just him, but everyone complicit in the systematic corruption at Meridian Research Institute. The stage was set for a confrontation that would echo through the highest levels of naval command and would transform everything Katherine had endured in service of a larger truth. Dr. Emily Rosewood moved through the corridors of Meridian Research Institute with the calculated hesitation of someone who had learned to make herself small, unremarkable, and utterly forgettable. At 36 years old, she possessed the kind of quiet presence that allowed her to slip through crowded hallways without drawing attention, to sit in meetings where her observations went unnoticed, and to observe the machinery of institutional corruption with the clinical detachment of a scientist studying a particularly toxic specimen under a microscope. Her light brown hair, when not pulled back in a severe bun mandated by Hartwell's arbitrary dress code, fell in subtle waves that suggested a woman who didn't quite care enough about her appearance to make much effort. Her wardrobe consisted entirely of muted colors: grays, taupes, navy blues, clothing that seemed designed to recede into the background of any room she entered. But the woman wearing this carefully constructed mask was something entirely different from what appeared on the surface. Captain Katherine Ashford had spent the last 12 years of her military career perfecting the art of becoming someone else. Her official file at Naval Operations Command read like a classified thriller, a psychological profile that had earned her the nickname the Ghost among intelligence circles, not because she was difficult to track, but because of her seemingly supernatural ability to inhabit assumed identities so completely that even sophisticated background checks sometimes failed to penetrate the authenticity of her covers. She had earned her captain's rank through a combination of tactical brilliance, operational success, and a demonstrated mastery of human psychology that had impressed even the most cynical veterans of the intelligence community. Her real educational background bore almost no resemblance to the credentials listed on Emily Rosewood's fabricated resume. Katherine held a master's degree from MIT in Advanced Systems Engineering, with a doctoral focus on organizational psychology and institutional corruption. She'd graduated summa cum laude from the Naval Academy with distinction in multiple technical fields. She spoke fluent Mandarin, Russian, Arabic, French, and Portuguese, languages she'd learned not from textbooks but through immersive undercover assignments in hostile territories where linguistic authenticity could mean the difference between exposure and operational success. Her security clearance was among the highest in the military establishment, granting her access to intelligence so sensitive that its mere existence was classified above the level of most Pentagon officials. Before Meridian, Katherine had spent 3 years embedded with a criminal organization in Eastern Europe, documenting human trafficking networks and money laundering operations that eventually resulted in 47 arrests and the dismantling of a network that had victimized thousands of people. She'd infiltrated a suspected terrorist cell in Southeast Asia, spending 18 months in constant fear of discovery while gathering intelligence that prevented 3 major attacks on American interests. She'd posed as a disgraced military officer to expose corruption within a supply chain management system that had been stealing resources meant for deployed troops. In every single operation, she had maintained her cover so completely that even the people working closest to her had believed in her assumed identity with the kind of certainty that came from direct observation. What made Katherine's psychological profile so unusual was not just her ability to assume false identities, but her capacity to do so while maintaining perfect operational security and emotional detachment. Most undercover operatives struggled with the psychological weight of living a lie. They developed sympathy for their targets. They second-guessed their missions. They sometimes experienced what psychologists called cover blur, the dangerous condition where the assumed identity began to feel more real than the operative's actual self. Katherine seemed immune to these psychological hazards. Her instructors noted in her evaluations that she possessed an almost inhuman ability to compartmentalize her consciousness, to maintain complete separation between her real identity and her cover persona, and to execute her assignments with clinical precision regardless of the personal cost. Her assignment to Meridian Research Institute had begun 6 months ago, initiated by Admiral Helena Winters herself after the Inspector General's office had exhausted traditional investigation methods. The facility's corruption had metastasized to the point where it threatened not just the integrity of sensitive defense research, but the security of classified technologies that were critical to American naval superiority. Hartwell's mismanagement and the culture of fear he'd cultivated had created an environment where safety protocols were ignored, where cost-cutting measures had compromised research quality, and where financial irregularities suggested systematic embezzlement on a massive scale. The transformation from Captain Katherine Ashford to Dr. Emily Rosewood had required 3 months of meticulous preparation. Katherine had studied hours of video footage showing researchers struggling with workplace anxiety. She'd conducted formal interviews with 7 former Meridian employees who had quit under mysterious circumstances, learning their mannerisms, their speech patterns, their hesitations, their small rebellions against authority. She'd fabricated a complete employment history for Emily, creating fictional references from people who would confirm her cover if contacted, though in ways that suggested she was competent but not exceptional. She'd even obtained false academic transcripts from a university that still maintained paper records from the years Emily was supposedly enrolled. The physical transformation had been equally deliberate. Katherine had deliberately allowed her posture to become slightly less rigid than her natural military bearing. She'd practiced walking with a fractional hesitation in her stride, as if she wasn't entirely confident in her direction or purpose. She'd learned to avoid making direct eye contact with authority figures in ways that suggested deference, rather than the tactical assessment that was Katherine's natural habit. She'd even modified her vocal patterns, adding slight uncertainties to her speech where Katherine would normally speak with absolute confidence. Most crucially, she had deliberately underperformed in her assigned research tasks. During her first weeks at Meridian, Katherine had intentionally struggled with procedures that she could have executed flawlessly. She'd asked questions that someone with her actual qualifications wouldn't need to ask. She'd made small errors in data analysis that seemed consistent with someone still learning the facility systems. Every action was calculated to position her as exactly the kind of person that someone like Hartwell would target, intelligent enough to be useful, but sufficiently uncertain to be controllable through intimidation. What Hartwell and everyone else at Meridian didn't know was that every interaction, every moment of simulated vulnerability, Every manufactured hesitation was being catalogued with photographic precision in Katherine's exceptional memory. She was documenting not just Hartwell's abuse, but the systemic failures that had allowed such abuse to flourish. She was building a comprehensive case that would expose not just individual misconduct but institutional corruption that reached into multiple levels of command and oversight. The other researchers at Meridian saw exactly what Katherine wanted them to see. A competent but struggling scientist trying to navigate a demanding workplace environment. They saw someone who was trying her best but sometimes fell short, who seemed nervous around Director Hartwell, who appeared to lack the confident bearing that came from elite educational institutions or prestigious previous positions. What they didn't see was the decorated military officer with 12 years of classified operations experience. They had no idea about the commendations locked away in secure Pentagon files or the intelligence agencies that considered her one of their most valuable assets. What they absolutely could not have known was that the woman they thought of as Dr. Emily Rosewood, uncertain, struggling, somewhat vulnerable, was actually someone far more dangerous than any of them could imagine. Meridian Research Institute occupied a sprawling campus of modernist buildings constructed from glass and steel, nestled against a backdrop of Pacific Northwest forests that seemed almost obscene in their natural beauty, given the corruption festering within those carefully designed corridors. The facility had been built 15 years ago as a crown jewel of American defense research, a place where the brightest scientific minds could collaborate on technologies that would give the United States a decisive advantage in underwater surveillance and maritime communication systems. From the outside, it presented an image of pristine professionalism, manicured lawns, cutting-edge laboratory equipment, a workforce that had been carefully vetted through extensive background checks and security clearances. But beneath that polished exterior lay an institutional infrastructure that had fundamentally rotted from the inside out. The corruption at Meridian wasn't sudden or accidental. It had developed gradually, like an infection that starts small and undetectable before spreading through the body with increasing virulence. When Director James Hartwell had assumed leadership 7 years ago, the facility had still maintained reasonably functional oversight mechanisms. Budgets were reviewed, safety protocols were enforced, and there was at least theoretical accountability for how taxpayer funds were being utilized. But Hartwell, a man whose ego was matched only by his cunning, had systematically dismantled each layer of oversight with the patience and precision of someone who understood that institutions are governed by human relationships more than by written policies. He'd started by isolating the facility's administrative officer, Dr. Marcus Brennan, a career civil servant who had maintained scrupulous records and insisted on following procurement regulations to the letter. Hartwell had convinced the Pentagon that Brennan's commitment to procedure was slowing down critical research timelines. Within 6 months, Brennan had been reassigned to a different facility, replaced by someone far more willing to interpret regulations creatively. He'd then gradually marginalized the facility's safety officer, Lieutenant Commander Sarah Powell, by claiming that her concerns about laboratory protocols were based on outdated military standards rather than civilian research best practices. Powell had eventually taken early retirement rather than continue fighting a battle she couldn't win. With the oversight mechanisms neutralized, Hartwell had begun implementing what could only be described as a reign of institutional terror. He'd established a command culture where questioning his decisions wasn't just discouraged. It was systematically punished through career sabotage, public humiliation, and systematic exclusion from any positions of influence or advancement. Researchers who raised concerns about safety protocols found themselves assigned to the most tedious aspects of projects, their names removed from publication credits, their recommendations ignored in favor of Hartwell's preferred approaches regardless of their scientific merit. The financial irregularities had become increasingly brazen. Equipment purchased for specific research projects would mysteriously disappear from inventory, only to be found months later in laboratory spaces controlled directly by Hartwell. Budgets allocated for one purpose would be redirected to other uses without documentation or authorization. Contractors would submit invoices for work that had never been performed, invoices that somehow made it through approval processes that should have flagged them immediately. Over the course of 5 years, investigators would later calculate that nearly $8 million had been diverted from legitimate research purposes into accounts that remained deliberately obscured through layers of shell corporations and creative accounting. But the most insidious aspect of Meridian's corruption wasn't the financial theft. It was the psychological infrastructure Hartwell had constructed to ensure that people stayed silent. He'd created an environment where fear was the primary motivator, where anyone who threatened the status quo faced consequences that ranged from career destruction to complete professional and social isolation. He'd learned which people were ambitious enough to be motivated by promises of advancement, and he'd cultivated relationships with them by ensuring they received disproportionate credit for successful projects and protection from any consequences of failures. He'd identified which people had external vulnerabilities, financial troubles, family situations that required mobility, or personal circumstances that made them desperate to maintain employment, and he'd exploited those vulnerabilities ruthlessly. The safety violations had become particularly alarming to anyone who understood the implications of working with experimental underwater technologies. Pressure testing protocols had been abbreviated to save time. Equipment maintenance schedules had been deferred to cut costs. Researchers were being pressured to work with untested systems that violated multiple safety standards. There had been 3 accidents in the past 18 months, incidents that should have triggered mandatory federal investigations but which Hartwell had managed to minimize and contain through a combination of downplaying severity and carefully limiting who knew about the incidents. One researcher had suffered a decompression injury while testing a prototype communication system. Another had been exposed to chemical contamination in a laboratory where safety protocols had been compromised. A third had experienced equipment failure that could have resulted in serious injury if the backup systems hadn't functioned. Each incident had been handled quietly, with the injured researchers offered financial settlements in exchange for their silence and their agreement not to file official reports. It was a classic abuse of power, using financial leverage to suppress evidence of institutional negligence. The reports that had eventually reached the Navy's Inspector General had come from people who'd finally reached the breaking point. A senior researcher named Dr. Nathan Kirkwood had witnessed safety protocols being deliberately violated and had tried to escalate his concerns through official channels only to have his complaints systematically ignored. He'd eventually contacted an old friend in the Navy who'd directed him to the Inspector General's office. A junior technician named Lisa Chun had discovered financial irregularities while updating inventory systems and had become so horrified by the pattern of theft that she couldn't remain silent. Despite understanding the professional consequences her whistleblowing would trigger, their reports had been corroborated by anonymous complaints from at least a dozen other employees who were too afraid to publicly attach their names to allegations against Hartwell. The cumulative weight of these reports had finally forced the Navy to acknowledge that something was seriously wrong at Meridian. But when initial investigations had been conducted using traditional methods, Hartwell had been ready. He'd coached his network of loyal employees on what to say. He'd ensured that any paper trails had been sufficiently obscured to prevent definitive proof. He'd leveraged his friendships with people in positions of authority to minimize the scope of inquiries and to ensure that investigations were handled with enough discretion that word could be carefully controlled. The corruption at Meridian had become systematic enough that it required someone extraordinary to expose it. It needed someone who could penetrate the wall of fear that Hartwell had constructed, who could observe the patterns of abuse without triggering the defensive mechanisms that had protected Hartwell from previous investigations, and who could document the reality of institutional dysfunction with enough specificity that no amount of clever explanation or political maneuvering could explain it away. The Navy's leadership had determined that only a comprehensive undercover investigation could uncover the full scope of what was happening. That determination had led them directly to Katherine Ashford. Director James Hartwell surveyed his domain from the elevated vantage point of his corner office on the 3rd floor of the Meridian Research Institute's administrative building, his posture radiating the absolute confidence of someone who had never encountered meaningful resistance to his authority. At 52 years old, he possessed the kind of physical presence that suggested a man who had once been formidable but was gradually surrendering to the slow decay that comes with age and indulgence. His frame, which had probably been athletic in his youth, now carried a softness around the middle that his expensive suits couldn't quite conceal. His steel-gray hair was meticulously styled, and his pale blue eyes held a particular quality that Katherine had encountered countless times in her previous assignments. The cold, predatory gaze of someone who derived genuine pleasure from exercising power over others who had no ability to fight back. Hartwell was the antithesis of the kind of leader that Meridian was supposed to have. He wasn't a visionary scientist or a brilliant strategist. He was a political operator, someone who had risen through the ranks of defense contracting not because of exceptional talent but because of an intuitive understanding of how bureaucratic systems could be manipulated and how human psychology could be leveraged to consolidate power. He'd spent his career moving between various research facilities and defense projects, and at each stop, he'd left behind a trail of demoralized employees, compromised research integrity, and financial irregularities that somehow never quite rose to the level of definitive proof. What made Hartwell particularly dangerous was his sophisticated understanding of institutional vulnerability. He knew exactly how to operate in the gray areas between what was technically legal and what was obviously corrupt. He understood that military oversight was often reactive rather than proactive, that investigations took time to initiate and longer to complete, and that by the time any serious scrutiny might arrive, he could have already moved on to his next position. He'd cultivated a network of relationships throughout the defense contracting world. People who owed him favors, people who benefited from the systems he'd constructed, people who had learned that cooperating with Hartwell was far less painful than resisting him. His management philosophy was deceptively simple. Identify the ambitious, reward them handsomely, and ensure their complicity in the system by making them beneficiaries of his corruption. For those who weren't ambitious, or who possessed principles that made them resistant to compromise, he employed a different strategy. He identified their vulnerabilities, financial desperation, family situations that required them to remain in one location, psychological susceptibility to intimidation, and he exploited those vulnerabilities with methodical precision. Hartwell had been Katherine's primary target from the moment she'd arrived at Meridian, though he didn't know that. Her preliminary research, conducted through classified channels and utilizing Navy intelligence resources, had identified him as the nexus point of virtually all the facility's dysfunction. The safety violations originated from his decisions. The financial irregularities traced back to accounts he controlled or influenced. The pattern of harassment and intimidation flowed directly from his management directives and the example he set through his daily behavior. Previous investigations into Hartwell's conduct had failed because they'd relied on formal procedures and official channels that Hartwell had learned to navigate with the expertise of someone who'd been playing this game for decades. But Katherine understood that documentation and testimony could only take investigation so far. What was needed was someone who could observe Hartwell's actual behavior in real time, who could witness his methods of intimidation and control, who could see the mechanisms by which he maintained power over the people around him. The preliminary reports Katherine had received before her assignment had described Hartwell as difficult and temperamental. The classified assessments had been far more precise. He was characterized as narcissistic, with a demonstrated pattern of sadistic gratification in humiliating subordinates. His psychological profile indicated someone with profound insecurity masked by aggressive confidence, someone who required constant validation of his power, and who became increasingly hostile when his authority was questioned in any way. He surrounded himself with people he could dominate, and he actively worked to eliminate anyone who demonstrated independence or critical thinking that might challenge his decisions. During her first week at Meridian, Katherine had observed Hartwell's interaction patterns with meticulous attention. She'd noted how he praised employees who simply agreed with his decisions while finding fault with those who offered alternative perspectives, regardless of the quality of those perspectives. She documented how he would make decisions that contradicted established safety protocols, then punish anyone who questioned those decisions. She'd watched him publicly humiliate a researcher for a minor procedural error, then reward a different researcher for making an identical error, solely because the second researcher had been sufficiently obsequious in their apology. What became clear to Katherine was that Hartwell's abuse wasn't incidental to his management style. It was central to it. He derived genuine psychological satisfaction from exercising power over people who couldn't effectively resist. He created situations where subordinates were forced to choose between their professional integrity and their employment security, and he seemed to take particular pleasure in watching people make compromises they would later regret. He was the kind of man who would deliberately create impossible situations, then punish people for their inevitable failure to resolve them. During week 3 of Katherine's assignment, Hartwell had begun taking particular notice of her. His attention wasn't positive. Rather, he seemed to identify her as the kind of person who would serve as a useful target for his particular brand of psychological manipulation. She was intelligent enough to understand his criticisms but not so confident in her position that she could dismiss them. She appeared to lack powerful connections or advocates within the system. She seemed the type who would internalize criticism rather than defend herself, which was exactly the kind of victim that Hartwell found most satisfying to target. He'd started with small incidents, finding fault with her work in ways that contradicted the assessments of her actual supervisors, assigning her to unpleasant duties that fell outside her job description, making public comments that suggested her competence was questionable, all while maintaining the veneer of someone genuinely concerned about her professional development. These small escalations were designed to establish dominance, to make clear that he could make her professional life difficult if she didn't demonstrate sufficient deference. What Hartwell didn't understand was that Katherine was documenting every interaction, analyzing every pattern, building a comprehensive psychological profile of his methods that would eventually be presented to people with far more authority than he possessed. She was studying him the way an entomologist studies an insect, observing his behavior with clinical detachment while he believed he was successfully intimidating someone who was fundamentally powerless. The other staff members at Meridian recognized what was happening, and they watched with a mixture of sympathy and relief. Katherine had become the focus of Hartwell's attention, which meant that other employees were temporarily getting relief from his harassment. It was a cruel dynamic, but it was also predictable. This was how Hartwell maintained control, by identifying targets and directing his abuse at specific individuals, while the rest of the organization tacitly accepted the situation in exchange for temporary respite. What none of them could have possibly understood was that Katherine wasn't merely enduring Hartwell's abuse. She was deliberately positioning herself as his primary target, ensuring that she would become the focal point of his attention and his worst impulses. Every interaction was carefully calibrated to make her seem more vulnerable, more isolated, and more obviously a target for his particular brand of cruelty. She was setting a trap, and James Hartwell was walking directly into it with the absolute confidence of someone who believed his power was unassailable. The escalation of Hartwell's harassment campaign against Katherine began subtly during the 4th week of her assignment at Meridian, following a pattern so deliberate and calculated that it became clear he'd refined his methodology through years of practice. The initial phase consisted of what could charitably be described as professional criticism, but what was actually systematic psychological manipulation designed to undermine her confidence and establish his absolute dominance over her work environment. During a research team meeting attended by 14 staff members, Hartwell interrupted Katherine mid-presentation to point out what he claimed were fundamental errors in her methodology, despite the fact that her approach had been explicitly approved by the senior research scientist overseeing the project. "Dr. Rosewood, I'm wondering if you actually understand the principles you're supposed to be implementing," Hartwell had said, his voice carrying the theatrical disappointment of a parent criticizing a child's obvious failure. "These are graduate-level concepts, and you seem to be struggling with even the basics. Perhaps we should reconsider whether this assignment is appropriate for your skill level." The other researchers had shifted uncomfortably in their seats, recognizing the moment as the opening move in what they'd all witnessed countless times before. Katherine had responded with precisely calibrated uncertainty, apologizing for her apparent misunderstanding and asking for clarification on what she'd supposedly gotten wrong. In reality, her methodology had been flawless, but contradicting Hartwell in any meaningful way would have accomplished nothing except to accelerate his campaign against her. Instead, she allowed him to correct her approach, even though his suggested modifications would actually compromise the research quality. This pattern repeated itself relentlessly over the next several weeks. During one particularly brutal afternoon, Hartwell had publicly criticized Katherine for what he claimed was careless work in organizing laboratory equipment, despite the fact that the equipment had been properly maintained according to every documented standard. He demanded that she spend the entire evening reorganizing systems that were already correctly organized, forcing her to miss dinner and work until well after the facility's normal operating hours. Katherine had endured the assignment with outward compliance while internally documenting every detail with meticulous precision. She'd noted the exact time Hartwell had issued the directive. She'd recorded the names of the 17 staff members who'd witnessed his public criticism. She'd documented the false basis for his complaint and the unnecessary nature of the work he'd assigned. Each incident was being carefully filed away in her exceptional memory, ready to be transcribed into the comprehensive report that would eventually reach Admiral Winters. The psychological pressure began to escalate in the 6th week when Hartwell introduced a new tactic designed to increase Katherine's isolation. He began assigning her to work shifts that deliberately separated her from the rest of her team. She would be scheduled to conduct equipment maintenance during hours when the main laboratory was closed, forcing her to work in isolation while her colleagues collaborated on active research projects. On other occasions, he would assign her to tasks in the facility's basement archive, cataloging decades-old research records in a climate-controlled storage facility that was physically separated from the main research areas. These assignments served multiple psychological purposes. They kept Katherine away from informal interactions where she might develop stronger relationships with her colleagues. They prevented her from observing the actual research being conducted, which could have given her insights into safety violations or other problems. Most importantly, they reinforced the message that she was separate from the group, that she didn't belong in the collaborative spaces where the real work of Meridian was being conducted. During this same period, Hartwell began implementing a sophisticated strategy of selective praise and criticism. When other researchers accomplished similar tasks to those Katherine had completed, Hartwell would publicly commend them for their excellent work and their commitment to the facility's mission. When Katherine completed identical or superior work, he would find fault with her methodology, her attention to detail, or her understanding of the underlying principles. The inconsistency was obviously deliberate, designed to create a situation where Katherine could never quite understand what she needed to do to gain his approval. A particularly telling incident occurred during week 7 when Katherine and another researcher, Dr. Trevor Mitchell, were both assigned to conduct preliminary analysis on a new sensor technology. Mitchell's analysis was comprehensive but somewhat superficial, offering general observations without much depth of investigation. Katherine's analysis was far more thorough, including detailed technical specifications and identification of potential design flaws that could affect long-term performance. When Hartwell reviewed both analyses, he publicly praised Mitchell's work as exactly the kind of big-picture thinking that Meridian needed, while criticizing Katherine's work as unnecessarily pedantic and suggesting that her focus on minor technical details showed a lack of vision. The other researchers recognized the injustice of this assessment, and Katherine could see the discomfort in their expressions. But none of them said anything. Hartwell had established through years of consistent behavior that questioning his judgment was professionally dangerous. He'd created an environment where people had learned that silent compliance was preferable to righteous defense of injustice. By the 8th week, Hartwell had begun involving other staff members in Katherine's humiliation, using them as unwitting tools in his psychological manipulation campaign. He would ask them to review Katherine's work and find problems with it, often with an almost theatrical hopefulness in his voice that made clear he was expecting them to criticize her. Most complied, afraid of what might happen if they didn't, but their criticism was always hesitant and often contradicted the assessment of Katherine's actual supervisors. One particularly difficult moment occurred when Hartwell asked Dr. Rachel Hoffman, a senior researcher who'd previously shown Katherine some informal kindness, to conduct a detailed review of one of Katherine's literature summaries. The summary was actually exceptional, thorough, well-organized, and demonstrating a sophisticated understanding of recent developments in the field. But Hartwell's presence while Hoffman conducted her review created an implicit pressure to find fault. After several uncomfortable minutes of searching for problems that didn't exist, Hoffman pointed to a minor formatting inconsistency. Her face flushed with embarrassment at the pettiness of her criticism. Katherine had responded with graciousness, thanking Hoffman for catching the error and apologizing for her sloppiness. Internally, she was cataloging the incident as another example of how Hartwell's system worked, how he could corrupt even the well-intentioned people around him by creating situations where they had to choose between their conscience and their professional survival. The sleep deprivation began in week 9. Hartwell started scheduling Katherine for training sessions and mandatory facility inspections during hours when she should have been resting. A mandatory night shift at the facility's surveillance station, a 4 a.m. equipment inventory session, a late evening safety briefing that he claimed was specifically for her benefit, despite the fact that the information being presented was already documented in written materials she'd already reviewed. Each assignment was technically within his authority, but the cumulative effect was systematic exhaustion. Katherine's colleagues began noticing the physical toll. Dark circles appeared under her eyes. Her movements became slightly sluggish during afternoon research sessions. During morning briefings, she occasionally swayed almost imperceptibly on her feet. But she never complained. She simply showed up for her assigned duties and completed them with the same precision and professionalism she'd maintained since her arrival. Dr. Nathan Kirkwood, the senior researcher who'd eventually become a whistleblower, approached Katherine one afternoon with visible concern. "You look like you're barely holding up," he said quietly, glancing around to ensure Hartwell wasn't nearby. "Have you considered filing a complaint with Human Resources about the treatment you're receiving?" Katherine had smiled sadly. "On what basis? Everything he's assigning me is technically within his authority as director. It would be difficult to prove that the cumulative effect constitutes harassment rather than simply demanding work." Kirkwood had nodded grimly, recognizing the truth of her assessment. This was how Hartwell operated, with such sophistication and deliberate ambiguity that each individual action seemed potentially defensible while the overall pattern was obviously destructive. What none of them understood was that Katherine wasn't merely enduring this psychological warfare. She was allowing it to escalate precisely because she needed Hartwell to continue pushing boundaries. The more he demonstrated his patterns of abuse, the more witnesses observed his behavior, the stronger the eventual case against him would become. The breaking point arrived on a sweltering Friday afternoon in late summer when the temperature inside Meridian's main laboratory had climbed to nearly 85 degrees, despite the facility's supposedly state-of-the-art climate control systems. The air conditioning had been failing intermittently for weeks, a maintenance issue that Hartwell had repeatedly deferred because repair costs would cut into discretionary funds he preferred to redirect toward personal projects. The heat created a pressure cooker atmosphere that seemed to intensify everyone's stress levels and sharpen the already volatile dynamics within the facility. Hartwell had been in an unusually foul mood all morning, snapping at staff members for minor infractions and assigning punishments with the arbitrary cruelty of an absolute dictator. Katherine had observed his escalating volatility with the clinical detachment of someone trained to recognize patterns in human behavior. His pale blue eyes had taken on a manic quality, and his movements carried a kind of predatory energy that suggested he'd been building toward some kind of confrontation. The catalyst came during what should have been a routine quality assurance inspection. The research team had completed preliminary testing on a new underwater communication prototype, and the device had performed well within established parameters. Hartwell arrived unannounced at the testing station where Katherine was documenting the results, his presence immediately creating a tension that radiated through the laboratory. "Dr. Rosewood," he said, his voice carrying the theatrical calm that Katherine had learned to recognize as a warning sign of imminent escalation. "I'm looking at your test documentation, and I'm concerned about several aspects of your methodology." Katherine looked up from her work, her expression reflecting the careful uncertainty she'd cultivated throughout her assignment. "Of course, Director. What concerns do you have? These pressure measurements seem inconsistent with what I would expect from a properly conducted test," Hartwell continued, moving closer to Katherine's workstation in a way that was clearly designed to intimidate. "In fact, I'm wondering whether you actually know how to operate the testing equipment properly, or whether you've been conducting these experiments without adequate understanding of the underlying principles." The accusation was completely baseless. Katherine's testing methodology was flawless, her measurements were accurate, and her documentation was more thorough than that of most of the facility's senior researchers. 3 separate supervisors had already reviewed her work and signed off on its validity. But none of that mattered. Hartwell had identified his moment to escalate, and accuracy was irrelevant to his actual agenda. "I followed the standard protocol exactly," Katherine replied carefully, keeping her voice neutral despite the obvious injustice of his criticism. "My supervisors reviewed and approved my methodology before I began testing." "Your supervisors," Hartwell said, his voice rising slightly in volume, "apparently don't understand the standards I expect at this facility. The fact that they approved your work suggests a broader problem with how quality control is being managed in this department." Around them, other researchers had stopped their work and were watching the interaction with obvious discomfort. Katherine could feel their eyes on her, could sense their anticipatory anxiety about where this confrontation was heading. Perhaps we could review the data together, Katherine suggested, attempting to redirect the conversation toward a collaborative resolution. I'd be happy to explain my methodology in detail, but Hartwell had no interest in collaboration. He had other objectives. He gestured sharply toward the testing equipment and the documentation Katherine had prepared. I want everyone in this laboratory to understand something about standards, he announced, raising his voice to ensure that all 23 staff members present could hear him clearly. Dr. Rosewood has apparently been operating under the assumption that good enough is an acceptable standard at Meridian Research Institute. I'm here to tell all of you that good enough is not good enough. Not even close. He began circling Katherine like a predator assessing wounded prey, his movements deliberately theatrical and designed for maximum psychological impact. What Dr. Rosewood has demonstrated is a fundamental misunderstanding of what we're trying to accomplish here. We're not conducting routine research. We're developing technologies that will be critical to American naval superiority. Do you understand what that means, Dr. Rosewood? It means that mistakes aren't just academic failures. They're potential threats to national security. Katherine remained silent, understanding that any response would only escalate his aggression. She kept her expression neutral, though internally she was cataloging every detail of the moment. The exact time, the precise words Hartwell was using, the names of every researcher present, the exact nature of his accusations. You're going to redo these tests, Hartwell announced, pointing at her workstation. Completely. From the beginning. And this time, you're going to do them correctly. The tests are complete and documented, Katherine said carefully, still maintaining her tone of professional respect. The results are valid. Redoing them would waste resources and delay the project timeline. The moment those words left her mouth, Katherine recognized the subtle shift in Hartwell's demeanor. She had contradicted him. Not aggressively, not disrespectfully, but she had stated a fact that contradicted his assessment. That was unacceptable to someone like Hartwell, someone for whom absolute authority was non-negotiable. You're questioning my judgment? His voice had dropped to a dangerous quiet. You think you understand this facility's standards better than I do? Before Katherine could respond, Hartwell made a gesture toward two of the facility's junior staff members, engineers named David Park and Kevin Torres, who had been struggling in their positions and were desperate to gain Hartwell's approval through any available means. Park, Torres, I want you to escort Dr. Rosewood to the equipment storage facility. I'm assigning her to a complete inventory and organization of all testing equipment in the facility. She's going to spend the rest of the day and the entire evening cataloging, cleaning, and reorganizing every piece of equipment in that storage area. Maybe that will help her develop an appreciation for the standards we maintain at Meridian. The other researchers exchanged uncomfortable glances. The equipment storage facility was in the basement, separated from the main laboratory areas. The inventory project would take many hours to complete. It was an arbitrary punishment designed purely to humiliate and exhaust. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Director, that task would require pulling me from my scheduled research responsibilities, Katherine said, her voice remaining respectful but firm. Dr. Chun is expecting me to complete the data analysis for the communication prototype. If I'm assigned to the equipment inventory, then Dr. Chun will have to adjust her expectations. Hartwell cut her off. Or perhaps she can explain to me why the research schedule is more important than maintaining proper facility standards. Is that what you're suggesting, Dr. Rosewood? It was a trap. If Katherine agreed to the assignment, she would be demonstrating submission and removing herself from her actual research work. If she refused, she would be directly contradicting Hartwell's authority. Either way, he had maneuvered her into a position where her response would justify further escalation. Katherine made her choice. She stood, gathering her documentation and nodding to Park and Torres. I understand, Director. I'll begin the inventory immediately. As she walked toward the storage facility with the two engineers flanking her, Katherine could feel the weight of the other researchers' gazes. She knew that what had just occurred would already be circulating through the facility's informal communication networks. She knew that Hartwell's arbitrary cruelty would be reinforcing the atmosphere of fear that he'd cultivated. And she knew that he believed he'd successfully demonstrated his absolute authority over her. What he didn't understand was that he'd just provided her with exactly what she needed. A public, witnessed incident of abuse that went beyond the gray areas of workplace conduct and entered the territory of obviously unjust harassment. The basement was dim and climate-controlled, filled with rows of equipment from decades of research projects. Katherine spent the next 12 hours meticulously cataloging, cleaning, and reorganizing equipment that was already properly maintained. The work was monotonous and exhausting, designed purely to break her spirit and demonstrate that Hartwell could force her to waste her time and energy on meaningless tasks whenever he felt inclined. Around 11 p.m., as Katherine was working through the final sections of the inventory, she received a text message on her personal phone. It was from a secure military communications number. Status report. When you're ready to proceed. Katherine took a deep breath, understanding that she'd reached a critical juncture in her mission. Hartwell had escalated beyond the point where traditional investigation methods could dismiss or minimize his behavior. She had witnesses. She had documentation. She had evidence of systematic abuse that went beyond questionable management decisions into the territory of clear workplace harassment. It was time to end the mission and initiate the next phase. The basement storage facility was silent except for the low hum of the climate control system as Katherine completed the final entries in the equipment inventory sometime after midnight. Her back ached from hours of lifting and organizing heavy equipment. Her hands were raw from cleaning decades of accumulated dust and grime from laboratory instruments that Hartwell had arbitrarily decided needed reorganization. She was physically exhausted in a way that went beyond simple fatigue. This was the deep, bone-weary exhaustion that came from enduring prolonged psychological stress combined with pointless physical labor. But as Katherine sat alone in the basement surrounded by organized rows of research equipment, she wasn't thinking about her physical discomfort. She was thinking about the 17 researchers who'd watched Hartwell publicly humiliate her. She was thinking about David Park and Kevin Torres, both of whom had been forced to participate in her punishment despite their obvious discomfort with what was happening. She was thinking about Dr. Nathan Kirkwood's expression of sympathetic concern and the recognition in his eyes that he was witnessing something fundamentally unjust. She was thinking about the pattern of behavior that Hartwell had demonstrated across the 8 weeks of her assignment, behavior that was now reaching critical mass. Katherine climbed the basement stairs and made her way toward the facility's administrative wing, moving through the darkened corridors with the careful precision of someone trained to navigate hostile environments without being detected. The administrative building was nearly empty at this hour. Only the security personnel remained in the main lobby, and they barely glanced up as Katherine passed through, her white lab coat and access badge marking her as someone who belonged in the facility. The payphones remained where they'd always been, located in a semi-private alcove near the administrative offices. Katherine had studied the facility's layout thoroughly enough to know that this location offered reasonable privacy while still being within the building's security system. She inserted coins and dialed a number she'd memorized months ago, a secure military line that was answered on the second ring by a professional voice Katherine had come to recognize over the course of her assignment. "This is Colonel Marcus Vance, Naval Intelligence Operations," the voice said. "Identify yourself." "This is Captain Katherine Ashford," she replied, keeping her voice low but clear. "I need to report a critical incident at Meridian that requires immediate escalation. My operational security has been compromised, and I've been subjected to unauthorized workplace harassment, including public humiliation and arbitrary punishment." There was a pause, the kind of pause that came when someone was processing information they'd been hoping to avoid receiving. "Explain the situation," Vance finally replied. Katherine provided a detailed account of the afternoon's events. She described Hartwell's public criticism of her work, criticism that contradicted the assessment of her actual supervisors. She detailed his accusation that her research methodology demonstrated a fundamental misunderstanding of facility standards. She outlined his assignment of the arbitrary equipment inventory as punishment for her implicit challenge to his authority. She described the 23 witnesses present in the laboratory and named the 2 engineers he'd forced to escort her to the storage facility. "This is extremely serious," Vance said when she finished her report. His tone had shifted from professional neutrality to something that suggested genuine concern. "More serious than what happened to you personally. This demonstrates that Hartwell has completely abandoned any pretense of following proper management procedures. He's operating as if he's genuinely immune to accountability." "What are my orders?" Katherine asked, understanding that the mission parameters had fundamentally changed. She was no longer a passive observer documenting institutional problems. She was now an active participant in an incident that would require official response. "Continue your assignment for the next 48 hours, Vance instructed. "Document everything. Continue your normal duties as if nothing has changed. Do not take any actions that might alert Hartwell to the fact that his behavior has triggered an official investigation." "But Katherine, I need you to understand something. What you're describing suggests that Hartwell has become desperate or believes himself to be genuinely untouchable. Either way, that makes him more dangerous, not less. Be careful." "Understood, sir," Katherine replied. "Admiral Winters is going to want a comprehensive briefing on this incident," Vance continued. "This might be the trigger we've been waiting for, the kind of public witness behavior that can't be explained away by Hartwell's network of allies. But we need to handle the next 48 hours carefully to ensure that the evidence chain remains intact." After ending the call, Katherine remained at the pay phone for several minutes, staring at nothing in particular, while her mind processed the implications of what had just occurred. The mission had entered a critical phase. Everything that happened next would determine whether the investigation she'd spent 8 weeks conducting would result in meaningful consequences or whether Hartwell would once again manage to insulate himself from accountability through his network of political connections and carefully cultivated allies. She made her way back to the barracks where the non-residential staff at Meridian were provided with basic sleeping accommodations. The building was quiet, most people either asleep or still working late in various laboratory spaces throughout the facility. Katherine found her small room and lay on the narrow bed, staring at the ceiling while her mind continued processing the events of the day. Around 2 a.m., there was a soft knock on her door. Katherine tensed momentarily, then recognized the knock pattern as belonging to Dr. Rachel Hoffman, the senior researcher who'd been forced to find fault with Katherine's work weeks earlier. Katherine opened the door to find Hoffman standing in the hallway, her expression a mixture of concern and something that suggested she'd been gathering her courage to make this late-night visit. "Are you okay?" Hoffman asked quietly, glancing around to ensure they weren't being observed. "What happened this afternoon was completely unfair. Everyone in the lab knows that your testing methodology was correct. Hartwell was just looking for an excuse to demonstrate his authority." Katherine gestured for Hoffman to enter her room, and she closed the door carefully behind her. "I'm fine," Katherine replied, her voice gentle. "Hartwell's behavior today wasn't personal. It's just how he operates. He identifies targets and demonstrates his power over them. The rest of the staff stays quiet because they're afraid of becoming the next target." "That's exactly the problem," Hoffman said, her voice carrying an edge of frustration. "Everyone just accepts it. Nobody says anything. Nobody stands up to him. And nothing ever changes." Katherine studied Hoffman carefully, understanding the dynamics at play. Hoffman was intelligent and had maintained her professional integrity better than most people in Hartwell's sphere of influence. But she was also aware, on some level, that her sympathy for Katherine might be misinterpreted by Hartwell as insufficient loyalty to his authority. "Dr. Hoffman, I appreciate your concern," Katherine said carefully, "but I need you to understand that sometimes the best way to respond to injustice is to document it carefully and let official processes handle it. Getting yourself in trouble by defending me won't help anyone." Hoffman nodded slowly, recognizing the wisdom in Katherine's assessment even though it frustrated her. "Just know that what happened today wasn't okay," she said. "And if there's anything you need, anything at all, please let me know." After Hoffman left, Katherine returned to contemplating the ceiling. Word of the afternoon's incident was already spreading through Meridian's informal communication networks. By morning, everyone at the facility would know that Hartwell had publicly humiliated Katherine and assigned her arbitrary punishment. They would understand on some level that what had occurred was unjust. But they would also understand, from years of experience, that there was nothing they could do about it. What they didn't understand was that Katherine wasn't actually as powerless as she appeared, and that Hartwell's behavior had just provided Admiral Winters with exactly the evidence she needed to justify a comprehensive investigation that would ultimately reshape everything at Meridian. Over the next 2 days, Katherine observed the facility with heightened awareness. She noticed how differently people interacted with her now that Hartwell had so publicly marked her as someone to be avoided. Several researchers who'd previously offered occasional collegial greetings now avoided eye contact. Others seemed to go out of their way to demonstrate their alignment with Hartwell's perspective on her competence. But she also noticed something else. There was a tension in the facility that hadn't existed before, an undercurrent of anticipation, as if people sensed that something significant was building. Whispered conversations would stop when Hartwell entered a room. Researchers would exchange meaningful glances when he made particularly arbitrary decisions. It was as if the incident with Katherine had triggered some kind of awareness that the status quo was becoming increasingly unstable. Dr. Nathan Kirkwood approached Katherine on Saturday morning as she worked in the laboratory. "Whatever you did or didn't do wrong," Hartwell's response was excessive, he said quietly. "I'm thinking about filing a formal complaint with the Pentagon about what I witnessed. Not just about what happened to you, but about the broader pattern of how he treats everyone at this facility." Katherine's response was carefully calibrated. "That's your decision to make, Dr. Kirkwood. But you should understand that official complaints can have professional consequences, regardless of their merit." "I know," Kirkwood replied, "but I'm reaching the point where I'm not sure I can continue working here in good conscience if I don't at least try to do something about it." Katherine recognized this as a critical moment. Kirkwood was genuinely considering taking action. Action that would be independent of her mission and would demonstrate to Hartwell that his behavior had triggered official concern from multiple directions. This was exactly the kind of cascading effect that could break through the wall of silence that had protected Hartwell for so long. "Do what you think is right," Katherine said simply. By Sunday evening, Katherine had received confirmation through her secure communication channels that Admiral Winters had approved the next phase of the investigation. The machinery of military justice was about to begin its inexorable movement toward confrontation with James Hartwell. The investigation machinery descended upon Meridian Research Institute with the methodical precision of a coordinated military operation, transforming the facility from a remote research complex into the epicenter of what would become one of the most comprehensive institutional corruption cases in recent Navy history. The process began at dawn on Monday morning when 3 unmarked sedans with official government plates pulled through the security checkpoint at Meridian's main entrance. The vehicles were positioned with tactical precision, angled for quick departure and positioned to provide clear sight lines to multiple exit routes, details that Katherine immediately recognized as indicators of a carefully planned operation. The occupants of those vehicles were military investigators from the Naval Criminal Investigative Service, agents from the Office of Inspector General, and legal specialists from the Judge Advocate General's Corps. They moved through the administrative building with the coordinated efficiency of people executing a plan that had been meticulously prepared over the course of weeks. Within 30 minutes, they had established temporary investigative offices in 3 separate conference rooms, set up recording equipment, and prepared interview stations equipped with the kind of documentation systems that suggested this investigation would be comprehensive and formal. The first sign that something extraordinary was occurring came when Captain Andrew Morrison, the facility's administrative officer, received a formal notice that he was to preserve all documents related to facility operations, financial transactions, and personnel management. The notice carried the unmistakable language of a legal preservation order, the kind of directive that made clear that official investigations had moved beyond preliminary inquiry into active evidence gathering. Within the hour, similar notices had been issued to every department head at Meridian, effectively creating a lockdown on document access and modification. Katherine observed the unfolding chaos with the clinical detachment of someone trained to recognize the mechanics of official investigations. She watched as Hartwell's normally confident demeanor began to crack. He emerged from his office around 8 a.m., his face pale and his movements jerky with barely contained panic. He immediately began closed-door conferences with various facility administrators, conversations conducted in hushed tones that Katherine could partially hear through the office building's thin walls. By mid-morning, the first recruits, or in this case, the first research staff members, were being called for formal interviews. The investigators worked methodically through a list that appeared to have been carefully prepared in advance. They started with researchers who'd filed previous complaints or who had expressed concerns about facility operations. Dr. Nathan Kirkwood was called first, emerging from his interview session nearly 2 hours later with an expression that suggested he'd been asked far more detailed and probing questions than he'd anticipated. Dr. Rachel Hoffman was called next, and Katherine noticed that Hoffman emerged from her interview with tears streaming down her face, though she seemed relieved rather than distressed. As Hoffman passed Katherine in the hallway, she briefly touched Katherine's shoulder in a gesture of solidarity before moving quickly away, understanding that drawing attention to Katherine at this moment would be inadvisable. The interviews continued throughout the day, conducted with a formality that made clear this was not a routine administrative inquiry. The investigators were asking detailed questions about specific incidents, requesting documentation of particular decisions, and requesting names of witnesses to various patterns of behavior. Katherine could hear fragments of conversations between interviewed staff members, words like assault, embezzlement, safety violations, and conspiracy being mentioned in hushed, shocked tones. By late afternoon, the facility was buzzing with speculation about what had triggered such a comprehensive official response. Rumors began circulating about anonymous complaints that had been filed with the Pentagon. Some researchers speculated that safety violations had finally triggered federal oversight. Others suggested that financial irregularities had been discovered during routine audits. The uncertainty created an atmosphere of tension that Katherine could feel radiating through every department of the facility. The most dramatic moment of the Monday investigation came when Master Sergeant Derek Paulson, the facility's chief of security, was escorted from the building by military police personnel. His departure was witnessed by dozens of staff members, and it sent unmistakable signals that the investigation had identified someone at the supervisory level as a potential participant in whatever institutional wrongdoing was being investigated. Paulson had been one of Hartwell's closest allies, someone who'd helped enforce the director's arbitrary rules and had been complicit in several incidents of harassment toward Katherine and others. His removal suggested that the investigators weren't simply targeting Hartwell but were examining the entire network of people who'd benefited from or enabled his corrupt system. Katherine was called for her interview at 4:47 p.m., a timing that she recognized as deliberate. By this point in the day, the investigators would have already conducted a dozen other interviews and would have developed a comprehensive understanding of the facility's dysfunction. They would have heard corroborating accounts of specific incidents. They would have developed a pattern recognition that would allow them to ask Katherine extremely precise and focused questions about her own experiences. The interview took place in one of the converted conference rooms, with a military investigator named Lieutenant Commander Sarah Chan and a legal specialist named Captain Robert Walsh present. Both conducted themselves with the professional courtesy of people performing a serious duty rather than with the suspicion that Katherine had sometimes encountered in less sophisticated investigative settings. Dr. Rosewood, I'm going to ask you some questions about your experiences working at Meridian Research Institute, Lieutenant Commander Chan began. I want you to know that you're not under suspicion of any wrongdoing. You're here as a witness to institutional practices that we're investigating. Is that clear? Yes, ma'am, Katherine replied, maintaining her carefully constructed persona of nervous cooperation. Have you personally experienced any incidents of workplace harassment or inappropriate treatment from Director Hartwell or other supervisory personnel? Chan asked. Katherine provided a carefully measured account of the previous 8 weeks. She described Hartwell's public criticism of her work despite its accuracy. She documented the arbitrary assignment of extended work hours and unusual duties. She described the incident of Friday afternoon, providing specific details about the public nature of the humiliation, the exact words Hartwell had used, and the names of every staff member she could recall who'd witnessed the confrontation. As Katherine spoke, she noticed that both Chan and Walsh were taking detailed notes, occasionally exchanging brief glances that suggested her testimony was corroborating information they'd already received from other sources. Chan asked follow-up questions that demonstrated knowledge of specific incidents and specific dates. information that could only have come from previous interviews or from documentary evidence. "Have you documented any of these incidents?" Walsh asked, his legal training evident in the precision of his question. "Only in my own memory," Katherine replied truthfully. "I've been careful to observe and document things mentally, but I haven't created written records that might be discovered." "That's actually quite fortunate," Walsh said, with a slight smile that suggested he understood more about Katherine's situation than he'd explicitly stated, "because it means that your testimony will be based on your direct observation rather than on written records that might be subject to questions about chain of custody or documentation procedures." The interview lasted 90 minutes. By the time Katherine was excused, she had provided comprehensive testimony about Hartwell's management practices, the psychological impact of his harassment campaigns, and the broader patterns of institutional dysfunction that she'd observed during her time at Meridian. As Katherine left the interview room, she passed through the administrative building's main lobby and observed the organized chaos of the investigation in full operation. Investigators were conducting interviews in multiple rooms simultaneously. Legal specialists were reviewing document stacks. Military personnel were photographing and cataloging evidence. The machinery of official accountability had been activated, and it was moving with the inexorable momentum of an institution that had finally decided that something needed to be done. That evening, Katherine received another secure communication from Colonel Vance. The message was brief. "Phase 2 approved. Stand by for next phase notification. Admiral Winters is extremely satisfied with the evidence we're accumulating." Over the next 2 days, the investigation continued to expand in scope. Additional investigators arrived from the Pentagon. Representatives from the Defense Contract Audit Agency began examining Meridian's financial records. Personnel from the Naval Safety and Occupational Health Office began reviewing equipment maintenance logs and safety protocol compliance documentation. Most significantly, Hartwell was notified on Tuesday afternoon that he was being placed on administrative leave pending the conclusion of the investigation. The formal notification came in the form of a military police escort removing him from the facility, a public departure that crystallized for everyone at Meridian that something fundamental had changed. The director who'd ruled the facility with absolute authority for 7 years was being removed from his position, and the power vacuum his removal created was already beginning to reshape the facility's institutional dynamics. Katherine observed his departure with quiet satisfaction, understanding that the most dramatic phase of her mission was approaching. The investigation had reached critical mass. The evidence had accumulated to the point where it could no longer be ignored or minimized. And Admiral Winters was preparing for the final confrontation that would reveal Katherine's true identity and transform everything that had occurred at Meridian into something far larger than a simple institutional corruption case. The revelation that would fundamentally recontextualize everything the Meridian staff thought they knew about their fellow researcher began in the pre-dawn darkness of Wednesday morning, though none of them realized it at the time. While most of Portland slept, a series of encrypted communications raced between secure military networks carrying information that would soon transform a remote research facility into the center of a storm that reached the highest levels of the Pentagon. The communications originated from Admiral Helena Winters' office and were directed to every commanding officer, every base commander, and every senior official with jurisdiction over the Naval Research and Development Command. The message was simple but profound: critical institutional investigation concluding. Command presence required for official proceedings at Meridian Research Institute on Wednesday at 0800 hours. This matter has reached the highest levels of command attention. By 7 a.m., the first signs of the extraordinary response began manifesting at Meridian. A convoy of military vehicles started arriving at the facility's main entrance. Not the unmarked sedans of investigators, but official military transport vehicles bearing the distinctive markings of Naval Command. Security personnel moved with increased urgency through the administrative areas. Facility staff who arrived for their regular work shifts noticed an unusual level of activity and coordination that suggested something far more significant than routine investigation procedures. Katherine, who'd arrived at the facility earlier than usual, observed these developments from her position in the main laboratory. She recognized the tactical precision of the vehicle positioning and the formal nature of the personnel movements. This wasn't simply the continuation of the previous day's investigation. This was something that had escalated significantly, something that suggested the involvement of command-level officials. At 7:47 a.m., the sound that changed everything arrived on the wind, the distinctive thump-thump-thump of helicopter rotor blades cutting through the morning air. The Meridian staff stopped their work and moved toward windows and doorways, watching as a military helicopter descended toward the facility's emergency landing pad with the coordinated precision of a major operation. The aircraft bore the distinctive markings of high-level command transport, and its arrival created an almost surreal quality to the morning, as if everyone present understood that they were about to witness something that would fundamentally alter the trajectory of their careers and their understanding of their workplace. Katherine stood with a small group of researchers who'd gathered near the laboratory windows, her trained eye immediately recognizing the operational significance of what was unfolding. The helicopter's arrival suggested someone with extraordinary authority, not simply a senior officer conducting routine oversight, but someone with the power to reshape institutional policy and personnel assignments. As the helicopter's rotors slowed, a steady stream of personnel emerged from the aircraft. Military police in dress uniform formed ceremonial ranks while intelligence officers and legal specialists moved with the focused intensity of people executing a plan that had been meticulously coordinated. But it was the figure who emerged last, moving with the deliberate pace of someone accustomed to absolute authority, that sent recognition ripples through everyone present. Admiral Helena Winters stepped onto the landing pad with the bearing of someone for whom military hierarchy held no mysteries and who wielded her authority with the natural confidence of someone who'd spent decades rising through the ranks. Her uniform displayed enough ribbons and decorations to humble even the most experienced veterans. As the Deputy Commander of Naval Intelligence Operations, she represented one of the highest levels of power within the military establishment. Her personal presence at Meridian meant that whatever had occurred at the facility had captured attention at the very apex of the naval command structure. Behind Admiral Winters came a procession of senior officers whose combined authority could reshape military policy with a single decision. Captain Lawrence Freeman from the Naval Inspector General's Office. Colonel Thomas Richardson from the Judge Advocate General's Corps. Commodore Michel Zhang from Naval Personnel Command. Their arrival, along with the security detail and legal specialists, created an unmistakable impression that this was not a routine investigative conclusion but something far more dramatic. The assembled researchers watched in stunned amazement as this display of military power organized itself with clockwork precision. None of them had ever witnessed such a concentration of high-ranking officers at Meridian. The magnitude of the response to what they'd initially assumed was a local facility problem was almost incomprehensible. Whispered conversations began immediately. Speculation about what Hartwell might have done that would warrant this kind of command-level response. Katherine remained composed, understanding with absolute certainty what was about to occur. She had been prepared for this moment through months of planning and 8 weeks of systematic documentation. She understood that Admiral Winters' arrival signaled the beginning of the final phase of her mission, the moment when her true identity would be revealed and when the full scope of the investigation would become public. At 8:15 a.m., all Meridian personnel were ordered to assemble in the facility's main conference center for what was described as an important announcement from Naval Command. The room filled with confused and anxious staff members, researchers who'd spent the last 3 days under investigation, and who were now about to witness something that would permanently alter their understanding of what had actually been happening at their workplace. Admiral Winters entered the conference center with her staff officers positioned strategically around the room. Her presence immediately commanded absolute attention. When she spoke, her voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "I am Admiral Helena Winters, Deputy Commander of Naval Intelligence Operations," she began. "For the past 3 days, my staff has been conducting a comprehensive investigation into allegations of institutional corruption, financial misappropriation, safety violations, and systematic abuse of authority at this facility. Today, I'm here to inform you of findings that will result in significant personnel actions and institutional reforms." The room fell into absolute silence. Katherine observed the expressions of the other researchers, shock, anxiety, and in some cases, recognition that what they'd suspected was far more serious than they'd allowed themselves to believe. What we have uncovered at Meridian Research Institute represents a systematic breakdown in command structure, oversight, and institutional integrity, Admiral Winters continued. Director James Hartwell has been placed under arrest and is currently in federal custody. He is facing charges including embezzlement, conspiracy, safety protocol violations, and abuse of authority under military law. Master Sergeant Derek Paulson has also been arrested and is facing related charges. Captain Andrew Morrison has been placed on administrative leave, pending further investigation into his role in covering up institutional problems. The shock in the room was palpable. Several researchers gasped. Others exchanged stunned glances with their colleagues. The reality of what had been happening at Meridian, the systematic fraud, the deliberate safety violations, the conscious decision to ignore institutional corruption, was finally being acknowledged at the highest levels. However, Admiral Winters continued, "What has made this investigation particularly successful is the work of someone operating within this facility under deep cover assignment. That person has been instrumental in documenting the patterns of abuse and corruption that would otherwise have remained hidden behind Hartwell's network of protection." The Admiral paused, letting her words settle into the minds of everyone present. Katherine felt every eye in the room turn toward her. The researchers had already begun to understand what was about to be revealed. "I want to introduce you to the real identity of the woman you have known as Dr. Emily Rosewood," Admiral Winters announced with the formal gravity of someone delivering a verdict that would reshape everything. "This woman is Captain Katherine Ashford, one of the Navy's most accomplished intelligence officers, currently assigned to my personal staff at Naval Intelligence Operations." The silence that followed was absolute and complete. The room seemed to freeze as the implications of Admiral Winters' announcement crashed over everyone present. Katherine stood and moved forward, her entire bearing beginning to transform in real time before their eyes. As she stood before Admiral Winters, Katherine's carefully constructed posture of uncertainty dissolved. Her shoulders straightened, her gaze sharpened. The hesitation that had characterized her movements for 8 weeks disappeared, replaced by the confident bearing of a seasoned military officer. Her voice, when she finally spoke, carried the crisp authority of someone accustomed to command. "I am Captain Katherine Ashford, United States Navy Intelligence," she said formally. "For the past 8 weeks, I have been conducting an undercover investigation into allegations of systematic abuse and institutional corruption at this facility. Everything I have observed, documented, and reported has been conducted under explicit authorization from Admiral Winters and the Naval Intelligence Operations Command." The reactions from the other researchers ranged from shock to comprehension to something that looked like betrayal. Dr. Rachel Hoffman's hand flew to her mouth. Dr. Nathan Kirkwood took an involuntary step backward. David Park, who had been forced to participate in Katherine's public humiliation, went pale as he understood the implications of what he'd actually done. But it was the moment when Katherine touched her hair, running her fingers through the auburn locks that had grown back fully since Hartwell's assault, that the symbolic weight of her transformation became complete. What he had intended as the ultimate humiliation had become instead the catalyst for the most meaningful victory of her career. Admiral Winters allowed the shock to settle over the assembled researchers for several moments before continuing her remarks. Understanding the psychological impact of what they just witnessed and the time required for comprehension to catch up with revelation. When she spoke again, her voice carried a note of personal concern that seemed to surprise many of those present, suggesting that she viewed Katherine not simply as an officer under her command, but as someone whose sacrifice deserved acknowledgement. Captain Ashford endured 8 weeks of systematic harassment, psychological manipulation, and ultimately physical assault while maintaining perfect operational security and gathering the evidence necessary to expose a criminal conspiracy that reached into multiple levels of this installation's command structure, Admiral Winters stated. She did this despite the genuine personal cost, despite the psychological toll of witnessing abuse being inflicted on her colleagues, and despite the physical exhaustion that came from deliberately allowing her tormentor to escalate his abuse in service of a larger truth. Katherine remained standing at attention beside Admiral Winters, her military bearing now unmistakable to anyone who knew how to recognize it. The contrast between her careful recruit posture of previous weeks and her current confident stance was shocking in its completeness. The woman these researchers had known as a struggling scientist was suddenly revealed as someone whose authority and capability far exceeded anything they'd assumed. The investigation that Captain Ashford initiated has uncovered evidence of crimes that extend far beyond the abuse she personally experienced. Admiral Winters continued. Our investigators have documented systematic financial misappropriation totaling approximately $8.7 million over a 5-year period. We have identified safety protocol violations that created genuine risks to personnel and to the integrity of classified research. We have documented a pattern of retaliation against employees who raised concerns about institutional practices. And we have identified a network of individuals at multiple levels of command who either participated in these crimes or deliberately ignored evidence of their occurrence. Captain Lawrence Freeman, the Naval Inspector General, stepped forward with documentation in his hands. Director James Hartwell is being charged with 15 federal counts including embezzlement, conspiracy, safety protocol violations, abuse of authority under military law, and assault on a superior officer, Freeman announced formally. Master Sergeant Derek Paulson is being charged with 8 counts including conspiracy and failure to report criminal activity. Captain Andrew Morrison is being charged with 3 counts of obstruction of justice and conspiracy. The specificity of the charges sent additional shock waves through the assembled researchers. These weren't vague allegations or administrative concerns. These were serious federal crimes with penalties that could include decades of imprisonment and dishonorable discharge from military service. However, Admiral Winters continued, I want to be absolutely clear about something that extends beyond the criminal charges against these individuals. The culture of fear and silence that allowed Hartwell's corruption to flourish unchecked represents a systemic failure of institutional leadership at Meridian. That failure will be addressed through comprehensive reforms, personnel reassignments, and new oversight mechanisms designed to prevent similar abuses from occurring in the future. Colonel Thomas Richardson from the Judge Advocate General's Corps stepped forward. The legal proceedings against the accused will be handled through the military justice system, he explained. There will be formal courts-martial for each defendant. Captain Ashford's testimony will be critical to establishing the patterns of abuse and the deliberate nature of the crimes committed. But I want to assure everyone in this facility that the military justice system takes these charges with absolute seriousness, and the punishments, if convictions are obtained, will be severe. The certainty in Richardson's voice left no doubt that the accused individuals would face genuinely serious legal consequences. This wasn't an investigation that might be minimized or explained away. This was the full weight of military and federal justice being brought to bear against people who'd abused their authority and exploited their positions. Katherine was approached by several researchers during the break that followed Admiral Winters' announcement. Dr. Rachel Hoffman approached with tears streaming down her face, her expression a complex mixture of shock, relief, and something that looked like vindication. You were playing a role the entire time, Hoffman said, her voice thick with emotion. When you thanked me for my sympathy, when you seemed vulnerable during all of this, you were actually conducting an investigation? I was documenting patterns of abuse, Katherine replied, her voice now carrying the crisp professionalism of her actual rank and position. Your sympathy was genuine, Dr. Hoffman. Your concern for my well-being was real. Those reactions from you and others like you were part of what demonstrated how Hartwell's system functioned, how good people were forced to choose between their conscience and their professional survival. Dr. Nathan Kirkwood approached Katherine with an expression of recognition and understanding. I was planning to file a formal complaint, he said. I was reaching the point where I couldn't remain silent anymore, regardless of the professional consequences. I had no idea that someone was already conducting an official investigation. Your integrity was evident, Katherine acknowledged. Your willingness to risk your own career to expose what you knew was wrong. That was genuine courage. It was also what tipped the balance toward moving forward with the investigation. David Park, the junior engineer who'd been forced to participate in Katherine's public humiliation, approached with visible distress. His face was pale, and his hands trembled slightly as he spoke. When Hartwell ordered us to escort you to the storage facility, I knew it was wrong, but I was afraid of what would happen if I refused. I kept telling myself it was just a work assignment, that I wasn't really participating in anything serious. But wasn't I? I was helping him abuse you, helping him demonstrate his power. Katherine's response was measured but not unkind. "You were placed in an impossible situation by someone who understood how to manipulate people's fear," she said carefully. "Hartwell exploited the power imbalance he'd created to make everyone complicit in his abuse. That doesn't absolve anyone of responsibility, but it does explain how institutional corruption can spread through an organization even among people who know, on some level, that what's happening is wrong." Kevin Torres, who'd also been forced to participate in Katherine's escort to the storage facility, nodded in grim recognition of her words. "He would have punished us if we'd refused," Torres said. "He'd already made it clear that not cooperating with his directives would result in negative evaluations, restricted assignments, and deliberate career obstruction. So we cooperated, even though we knew it was wrong." "That's exactly how systems like this maintain themselves," Katherine confirmed. "Fear becomes the currency that keeps everyone complicit. Breaking that cycle requires someone willing to endure the abuse long enough to document its patterns and present evidence that can't be explained away through institutional politics." As the day progressed, the full scope of what Katherine's investigation had achieved became increasingly apparent. Investigators presented evidence of specific financial transactions, safety protocol violations, and documented instances of harassment. Witness testimony from the researchers who'd filed complaints or raised concerns established a comprehensive pattern of institutional dysfunction. And Katherine's detailed account of her 8 weeks at Meridian provided the human context that transformed abstract allegations into concrete descriptions of how abuse had actually manifested in the facility's daily operations. By late afternoon, it became clear that the investigation had achieved its primary objectives. The evidence against Hartwell and his accomplices was overwhelming. The pattern of abuse was undeniable, and the institutional failures that had allowed the corruption to flourish had been thoroughly documented. Admiral Winters made a final statement to the assembled facility staff before departing Meridian. "Captain Ashford's sacrifice and professionalism have exposed serious problems that threaten the integrity of critical defense research," she announced. "The consequences for the individuals responsible will be severe, but more importantly, the reforms that will be implemented as a result of this investigation will ensure that what happened at Meridian never happens again. We are going to rebuild this facility's leadership, establish new oversight mechanisms, and create a culture of accountability that makes clear to everyone working here that institutional integrity is not negotiable." As Katherine watched Admiral Winters and her entourage prepare to depart, she reflected on the complex emotions of the moment. The mission was essentially complete. The investigation had succeeded beyond its original parameters. The evidence was conclusive. Justice was being served. But the personal cost had been significant. 8 weeks of maintaining a false identity. 8 weeks of enduring deliberate abuse. 8 weeks of watching genuinely vulnerable people suffer under Hartwell's arbitrary cruelty while being unable to intervene until the investigation was sufficiently comprehensive. The psychological recovery that would follow would take considerably longer than the investigation itself. But as Katherine stood on the grounds of Meridian Research Institute watching the military helicopters prepare for departure, she understood with absolute certainty that the sacrifice had been worthwhile. 6 months after the revelation that fundamentally transformed Meridian Research Institute, the facility had undergone such a comprehensive metamorphosis that it barely resembled the institution where Captain Katherine Ashford had once endured systematic abuse under the blazing Oregon sun. The physical infrastructure remained identical. The same modernist buildings, the same laboratory spaces, the same sprawling campus nestled against the Pacific Northwest forests. But the institutional atmosphere had been entirely reconstructed, from the leadership structure down to the fundamental culture that governed how people interacted with one another. Katherine stood at the edge of the main research plaza on a cold February morning, her hair now fully grown back to its natural length, falling in soft waves past her shoulders. She wore her dress uniform bearing the insignia of a full commander, a promotion that had been officially recognized just 2 weeks earlier in recognition of her exceptional service during the Meridian investigation and its aftermath. The silver insignia caught the morning light as she surveyed the facility that had been the site of both her greatest professional challenge and her most meaningful victory. The transformation of Meridian had become a landmark case in military institutional reform. The investigation that Katherine's undercover work had initiated had resulted in comprehensive changes to oversight mechanisms across the entire Naval Research and Development Command. Academic journals published analyses of how institutional corruption had been allowed to flourish. Military leadership training programs now used the Meridian case as a primary example of how cultures of fear and intimidation could poison institutions from within. The protocols that had been implemented as a result of the investigation, now known throughout Naval Command as the Ashford Protocols, were being adopted at other research facilities and defense contracting organizations. The trials that had followed Katherine's revelation had been swift and decisive. James Hartwell had initially attempted to claim that his management style, while perhaps aggressive, had not violated any laws. But faced with Katherine's detailed testimony corroborated by dozens of other witnesses, combined with documentary evidence of financial crimes and safety violations, he'd eventually pleaded guilty to most charges to avoid a lengthy trial. He'd been sentenced to 8 years in federal prison, with the understanding that additional charges related to specific safety violations might result in extended sentences. His military pension had been forfeited in its entirety, and he'd received a dishonorable discharge that would follow him for the remainder of his life. Master Sergeant Derek Paulson, who'd enabled much of Hartwell's abuse through his complicity as the facility's security chief, had received a 5-year sentence and had also lost his pension and received a dishonorable discharge. Captain Andrew Morrison, whose failure to report institutional problems had allowed the corruption to persist, had been sentenced to 3 years and had been required to resign his commission, effectively ending his military career. But perhaps the most significant outcome of the investigation had been the comprehensive reforms implemented throughout Meridian's operational structure. Dr. Victoria Chun, a respected administrator from another naval facility, had been appointed as the new director. Her leadership style stood in stark contrast to Hartwell's approach, collaborative rather than authoritarian, focused on research excellence rather than arbitrary authority, committed to creating an environment where people felt safe raising concerns about institutional problems. New oversight mechanisms had been established. An independent ethics board now reviewed significant decisions at the facility. Mandatory training on recognizing and reporting abuse had been implemented for all personnel. Whistleblower protections had been strengthened, and anonymous reporting mechanisms had been established to ensure that people could raise concerns without fear of retaliation. The most dramatic indicator of the institutional transformation was evident in the recruitment and retention of research personnel. In the year following Hartwell's arrest, Meridian had attracted applications from researchers who'd previously avoided working at the facility. Turnover rates had dropped significantly. Morale surveys showed dramatic improvements in how personnel rated the facility's work environment. The toxic culture that Hartwell had cultivated had been replaced by an environment that valued collaboration, integrity, and genuine commitment to research excellence. Katherine had been invited to Meridian today to speak to the current research staff about leadership, institutional integrity, and the courage required to stand up against corruption. As she prepared for her presentation, she reflected on the people whose lives had been transformed by the investigation. Dr. Rachel Hoffman had used the experience of witnessing Hartwell's abuse as a catalyst for becoming more vocal about institutional problems. She'd been selected to serve on the new ethics board at Meridian and had become instrumental in establishing the protocols that were now preventing abuse from taking root at the facility. Her confidence had blossomed once she was removed from the toxic environment, and she'd taken on leadership responsibilities that she'd previously been too intimidated to pursue. Dr. Nathan Kirkwood, whose willingness to file a complaint had been one of the triggers for the investigation, had been offered a position with the Naval Research Administration in Washington, where he was now helping to develop institutional policies designed to prevent similar corruption at other facilities. His integrity and his courage in speaking up, even when doing so had put his own career at risk, had been recognized and rewarded. David Park and Kevin Torres, both of whom had been manipulated by Hartwell into participating in Katherine's harassment, had worked through their guilt in professional counseling and had emerged with a deeper understanding of how institutional corruption functioned. Both had become advocates for creating workplace environments where people felt empowered to refuse unethical directives without fear of professional retaliation. Park had transferred to a different naval facility where he was now training junior engineers on ethical decision-making in high-pressure environments. Torres had remained at Meridian and had become instrumental in implementing the new safety protocols that prevented the kind of protocol violations that Hartwell had permitted. The current drill instructors, or in this case, the current facility management team, represented everything that Hartwell and his accomplices had not. They combined professional accountability with genuine respect for the people under their authority. They created work environments where research excellence was pursued through collaboration rather than intimidation. They demonstrated daily that institutions could be both demanding and humane. As Katherine prepared to address the assembled staff, she reflected on the complex legacy of her mission. The personal cost had been significant. The weeks of psychological recovery that had followed her return to normal duty had tested her resilience in ways that combat operations never had. During previous missions, she'd been operating against clearly defined enemies in hostile territory. At Meridian, she'd been forced to watch abuse being inflicted on her own people by someone wearing the same uniform she'd sworn to honor. The decision to let Hartwell's harassment escalate to the point of physical assault had been the most difficult choice of her career. She could have ended the investigation at any point by revealing her true identity. But doing so would have exposed only the surface level of corruption while allowing the deeper problems to continue festering unchecked. Every humiliation she'd endured, every arbitrary punishment she'd accepted, every moment of manufactured helplessness had been building toward a comprehensive case that would clean house not just at Meridian, but throughout the entire research system. Standing before the assembled researchers, Katherine began her presentation with a question that captured the essence of what she'd learned during her 8 weeks undercover. How many of you have witnessed something at work that you knew was wrong, but you remained silent because you were afraid of the consequences? She asked quietly. Nearly every hand in the room went up. Katherine nodded with understanding. That fear is how institutional corruption maintains itself. Good people remain silent because the cost of speaking up seems higher than the cost of complicity. But there's something important to understand about that calculus. When enough people remain silent, when institutional problems are allowed to fester unchecked, the ultimate cost becomes far higher than anyone initially anticipated. She spoke about her 8 weeks at Meridian, not hiding the difficulty of maintaining her cover or the genuine psychological toll of enduring deliberate abuse. She described the patterns she'd observed, how Hartwell had systematically isolated potential whistleblowers, how he'd exploited people's fear to make them complicit in his system, how he'd created an environment where questioning his authority seemed impossibly risky. The people who stood up to Hartwell, the people who filed complaints or who simply refused to participate in his harassment despite the pressure to do so, those people demonstrated genuine courage, Katherine said. And their courage, combined with institutional mechanisms for accountability, eventually broke through the wall of silence that had protected Hartwell's corruption. As Katherine concluded her presentation and answered questions from the assembled staff, she found herself thinking about what had changed not just at Meridian, but in herself. The experience of conducting such a comprehensive undercover investigation, of enduring abuse in service of a larger truth, of witnessing the mechanisms by which institutional corruption functioned and how it could be exposed, had fundamentally altered her understanding of what military service meant. Later that afternoon, as Katherine prepared to depart Meridian for the last time, she walked through the facility one final time. She paused at the location where Hartwell had publicly humiliated her, where he'd cut her hair as punishment for her implicit challenge to his authority. The plaza where that incident had occurred now hosted a plaque acknowledging the facility's commitment to institutional integrity and ethical leadership. It was a small gesture, but it symbolized something important, that what had happened there would not be forgotten, and that lessons learned through such trauma could be transformed into systemic change that protected future generations of researchers. As her staff car pulled away from Meridian, Katherine touched her hair one final time, running her fingers through the auburn locks that had fully recovered from Hartwell's rough cutting. The physical reminder of his assault had long since healed, but the experience had left her with something far more valuable than any scar could represent: the certainty that patience, documentation, and faith in institutional justice could ultimately prevail against even the most entrenched corruption. The desert sun was setting behind the distant mountains, casting long shadows across the research campus where justice had ultimately prevailed and where future generations of American researchers would work in an environment defined by honor, respect, and the unwavering principle that every person in uniform and every person in any institution deserve to be treated with fundamental dignity. Sometimes, Katherine reflected, the most important battles were not won through immediate retaliation or confrontation, but through the strategic patience of someone willing to document abuse carefully and trust in the ultimate power of truth and justice. The transformation of Meridian Research Institute stood as testimony to that principle, and as evidence that institutional corruption, no matter how deeply rooted or how carefully protected, could ultimately be exposed and eliminated by those with the courage to endure long enough to see the mission through to its conclusion. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.